The sedan smelled of bleach and stale cigarette smoke, the kind of smell that clings to the back of your throat and refuses to leave. Cole Hargrove had noticed it the moment he slid behind the wheel in the clubhouse lot, but he hadn't said anything. You didn't comment on things like that. Not when you were a prospect. Not when the president of your chapter had just handed you a suppressed pistol and told you to handle a problem. The Nevada desert stretched out on either side of the highway like a black wound in the earth, vast and absolute and indifferent to everything happening inside that car. It was 10 minutes past 2 in the morning. The dashboard clock glowed a dim amber. The heater fan ticked and rattled somewhere beneath the dash, pushing warm air that smelled faintly of rust across Cole's boots. Outside, the temperature had dropped into the low 30s, and a thin skin of frost was beginning to form on the guardrails along the highway shoulder. Cole kept both hands on the wheel at exactly 10 and 2. He drove 5 miles under the speed limit. He used his turn signals. He was a man who had just accepted an order to kill another human being, and he was driving like a retired school teacher on his way to Sunday church. The irony of that did not escape him. He didn't think about what waited for him at the end of the address glowing on the burner phone in the passenger seat. His mind, trained by 24 months of brutal discipline to stay quiet and focused under pressure, refused to go there. Instead, it went somewhere older. Somewhere it always went when the silence got too heavy. It went to Diane. He could picture her the way she looked on Tuesday mornings. Not the last Tuesday, not the one that mattered, but the ordinary ones before everything collapsed. She would sit at the kitchen table in her green robe, with a mug of black coffee pressed between both palms, reading something on her phone, occasionally letting out a small sound somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. The morning light through the window over the sink would catch the silver threading through her dark hair. She had started going silver at 38 and had never once considered coloring it. That was a very Diane thing. She called it her earned crown and dared anyone to argue with her about it. Cole had never argued. He had loved that silver. He had loved all of it. The last Tuesday had looked nothing like those mornings. He had come home at 6 in the morning after a 14-hour run across 3 state lines. He had been driving a cargo van for a man named Rhett Galloway, who had a full patch on his back and a permanent sneer on his face, and who had not said a single word to Cole the entire trip, except to tell him which exit to take. Cole had parked the van, walked the half-mile back to the apartment, and found 2 suitcases standing in the hallway like a pair of silent accusations. Diane had been sitting at the kitchen table, not in her green robe, dressed, jacket on, keys in her hand. She hadn't cried. That was what he remembered most clearly. She had looked at him with something that was worse than anger, a kind of exhausted certainty, and said, "I can't keep loving someone who doesn't belong to himself anymore, Cole." He had stood in the doorway with motor oil on his hands and the smell of the Nevada highway in his clothes, and he had not known what to say. He had tried to explain. The club, the brotherhood, the things a man needed that civilian life couldn't give him. She had listened to all of it. She had been very patient. Then she had picked up her suitcases and walked past him out the front door. He had not stopped her. He had told himself it was because she was right, that he had chosen this path and he owed it to the choice to see it through. That once he earned the patch, once he became a full brother with standing and respect, and the kind of loyalty that only men who have bled together can build it, would mean something. It would retroactively justify every sacrifice, including the one wearing a green robe at a kitchen table he would never sit at again. He had told himself that for 14 months. The burner phone buzzed once against the passenger seat, then went still. Cole glanced at it. The screen was dark. Just the road ahead, in the desert darkness, and the distant glow of Henderson bleeding orange into the sky along the horizon. He had been a prospect for the Iron Vale MC High Desert chapter for 2 years, 1 month, and 11 days. Most men lasted 6 months before they quit or got pushed out. The ones who made it a full year were considered serious. 2 years made you either exceptional or pathological. And the members of the High Desert chapter had never been entirely sure which category Cole Hargrove fell into. They had watched him, tested him, broken him down in the way only men who have mastered institutional cruelty can break another man down patiently, systematically. targeting not the body but the architecture of his self-worth. He had come to the Iron Veil through Earl Maddox, a man the entire club called Bishop, for reasons that predated Cole's involvement and that nobody ever fully explained. Bishop had been the chapter's vice president for 11 years. He was a lean, weathered man in his early 60s with a gray beard trimmed close to his jaw and the kind of eyes that had seen enough of the world's ugliness to stop being surprised by any of it. He spoke rarely and precisely. He laughed at things other men didn't find funny and was unmoved by things other men found devastating. Cole had met him at a bike rally in Laughlin 3 years ago when Cole's shop was still solvent and his marriage was still intact and the world still operated according to rules Cole thought he understood. They had talked for 3 hours, just two men sitting on the tailgate of a truck in a gravel parking lot watching the sun go down over the Colorado River. Bishop hadn't recruited him that night. He hadn't sold him anything or pitched him on brotherhood or hinted at what membership might mean. He had simply talked to Cole the way men used to talk to each other before everything got complicated, directly, without performance, without agenda. He had treated Cole like someone worth talking to. That had been rarer than it should have been. When the shop failed 8 months later, when the marriage was fraying at every seam, and Cole was sleeping 4 hours a night in an empty building that smelled of metal shavings and motor oil and slowly dying ambition, he had called Bishop. Not for money, not for a job. Just because Bishop was the only person whose voice he could imagine tolerating at that particular moment of quiet devastation. Bishop had answered on the second ring. 3 weeks later, Cole was a prospect. The initiation had not been ceremonial. There was no ritual, no speech, no formal welcome. Wade Pruitt, the chapter sergeant-at-arms, a man built like a refrigerator left in the sun too long, had handed Cole a laminated card with a list of rules and told him if he broke any of them, they would know and he would regret it in ways that were not elaborated upon. Cole had read the card, memorized it, and handed it back. Then the work began. 2 years of it. The kind of work designed not to accomplish anything useful, but to demonstrate absolute subordination. Standing guard over motorcycles in 40-degree rain while the brothers drank inside. Mopping up after brawls at 3 in the morning while everyone else slept. Running errands at midnight across state lines without asking what was in the packages or where they were going. Taking orders from men he outworked, outthought, and in several cases could have physically dismantled, and responding to all of it with the same flat-train deference. Yes, brother. Right away, brother. No excuses, brother. He had taken a bottle to the side of the head outside a bar in Barstow when a rival club's member decided that Cole's presence in the parking lot was an insult worth addressing physically. Cole had gone down, gotten back up, and driven himself home without going to a hospital, without filing a police report, without saying a word to anyone, except to confirm the next morning that the chapter's property had been secured. Damon Voss, the chapter president, had nodded when he heard about it. That nod had felt at the time like the highest form of recognition Cole had ever received. Damon Voss. Cole thought about him now as the glow of Henderson grew brighter on the horizon. He thought about the pale blue eyes and the leather chair at the head of the church table, and the way Damon's voice dropped to something just above a whisper when he wanted you to understand that what he was saying was important. Damon was not a large man. He was average height, lean, with a face that had aged well in the way that certain predators age well, all angles and economy of expression. He had run the High Desert chapter for 9 years. Under his leadership, the Iron Veil had expanded their territory, consolidated their supply chains, and achieved a level of operational discipline that even their rivals acknowledged with grudging respect. He was also, Cole had come to understand, the most dangerous man he had ever been in a room with. Not because of the violence he could deploy, though that was real and well documented, but because of the patience. Damon Voss could wait. He could sit with a plan for months or years, tending it quietly, keeping it hidden until the moment was exactly right. He had the kind of strategic intelligence that in another life might have built corporations or won elections. In this life, it had built a criminal enterprise on a foundation of other men's absolute trust. Cole had trusted him completely until approximately 3 hours ago. He hadn't noticed the clubhouse atmosphere shifting at first. The evenings had a rhythm at the High Desert chapter, and Cole had learned that rhythm so thoroughly it had become instinctual. The jukebox running Skinnerd and Cash from 7 until whenever. The pool tables in the main room running all night. The particular cadence of conversations that rose and fell and occasionally spilled into violence and then subsided again. He had learned to read those patterns the way a ship's navigator learns weather. Tonight had felt wrong before he had walked through the door. The music had been off. That was the first thing. The jukebox sat dark and silent in the corner, which Cole had never seen before in 2 years. The main room was occupied, but subdued men sitting with drinks. They weren't finishing conversations that stopped when Cole entered and didn't restart. Rhett Galloway had been leaning against the bar with his arms crossed, and his permanent sneer dialed up to something that looked almost like anticipation. Wade Pruitt had appeared at Cole's shoulder within 30 seconds of his arrival, standing behind him close enough that Cole could feel the heat radiating off the larger man. "The president wants to see you in church." Those words had a specific weight in the Iron Veil. Church was the meeting room at the back of the clubhouse, accessible only through a pair of heavy oak doors with a deadbolt that only full patch members could open. Prospects did not enter church. The fact that Cole was being invited inside meant one of two things. Either his time as a prospect was over or something had gone very wrong. He had followed Wade through the main room and down the short hallway. At the oak doors, Wade had knocked twice, then pushed them open and stepped back, leaving Cole to enter alone. The room was everything the main bar was not. No windows, fluorescent lights overhead, the air dense with cigar smoke, and the particular stillness of men who have been sitting in serious conversation for a long time. Around the long oak table sat 11 fully patched members of the High Desert chapter. Their faces were familiar to Cole, in the way that the faces of authority figures are always familiar to people who have spent years beneath their authority, known completely in every detail of expression and mood while remaining fundamentally opaque. At the head of the table, Damon Voss had been watching Cole since the moment the door opened. Cole had crossed the room and stood at the end of the table opposite Damon. He had not been offered a chair. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and kept his eyes level and his face empty and waited. 2 years, Damon had said. His voice was exactly what it always was, quiet and precise and utterly certain of itself. 2 years you have been eating our dirt. You have kept your mouth shut. You took a bottle to the head in Barstow and didn't drop the club's property. We respect that. Thank you, Cole had said, flat and trained. Don't thank me yet. Damon had leaned forward then, and something in the quality of his attention shifted. Cole had felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Damon reached into his jacket and placed 2 objects on the table with the deliberateness of a man laying cards in a game he has already won. A burner phone and a compact pistol with a suppressor threaded onto the barrel. A suppressed .22 caliber. Cole knew what that was. Every man in that room knew what that was. It was not a weapon for a fight. It was a weapon for an execution. "We have a problem," Damon had said softly. "Someone has been talking to the wrong people. Federal task force has intercepted 3 of our northbound runs in the past 30 days. 2 of our brothers are looking at 20 to life because somebody decided their own comfort was worth more than this table." Cole had kept his face passive. The information wasn't new to him. The losses had been the talk of the clubhouse for weeks. But the way Damon was looking at him now was new. "I am giving you the address," Damon had continued. "You don't take your bike. You take the sedan out back. You go to the house. You walk in and you silence the problem. 2 in the chest, 1 in the head. You drop the weapon in the storm drain 3 blocks east, and you come back here." He had paused. The room had been so quiet Cole could hear his own pulse. "You do this, and when you walk back through that door, you won't be a prospect anymore. You'll be family. Forever." Cole had looked at the pistol on the table. He had thought with the strange clarity that comes at the edge of catastrophic decisions about the 2 years. The bottle in Barstow, the 14-hour runs, the Tuesday morning with the suitcases in the hallway. Every piece of himself he had surrendered in the belief that what waited on the other side was worth the cost. He had reached out and picked up the gun. He had picked up the phone. He had said, "I'll see you in a few hours, brothers." And Damon Voss had smiled. Now the Henderson exit was 2 miles ahead. Cole put on his turn signal and eased into the right lane. The sedan's tires hummed against the highway surface, and the desert fell away on both sides as the first streetlights of the suburb reached out to meet him. The transition was abrupt and disorienting, the way transitions always were out here. One moment you were in the absolute nothing of the Mojave dark, and the next you were on a four-lane road lined with chain restaurants and gas stations and the ordinary infrastructure of American domestic life. Cole followed the GPS on the burner phone through 3 turns and into a neighborhood that made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't expected. Manicured lawns, minivans and driveways, basketball hoops mounted above garage doors. A neighborhood where the most serious crimes were probably noise complaints and the occasional domestic argument that got too loud on a Friday night. The kind of neighborhood where people called the police when they heard something wrong and expected the police to come. He pulled the sedan to the curb 2 streets over from the address, killed the engine, sat in the silence for a full minute. The rational trained part of his mind was still operational. It was cataloging the details the way Bishop had taught him to catalog details back in the early months when Bishop would sit with Cole in the clubhouse lot and talk about situational awareness as though it were a philosophy rather than a skill. You don't look for threats, Bishop used to say. You look for inconsistencies. The thing that doesn't fit the pattern. That's always where the danger is. Cole looked at the neighborhood and found it consistent with itself. Quiet, residential, no obvious surveillance, no vehicles that looked out of place. The address was 4 houses down on the left side of the next street, and from where he was sitting, he could see the corner of the property, a large oak tree in the front yard casting the driveway in shadow. He thought about Bishop. It was not the first time he had thought about him tonight. Bishop had been threading through his thoughts since the moment Damon placed the gun on the table, a steady presence moving at the edges of everything the way the dead tend to occupy the living. 18 months ago, Damon had called the chapter together and told them that Earl Maddox had been killed. He had been in Kingman, Arizona, working a negotiation with a local outfit that had been encroaching on Iron Veil territory. Something had gone sideways. The details were vague. The outcome was not. Damon said that Bishop had died the way he had lived, doing what needed doing for the Brotherhood, and that the chapter would honor him accordingly. They had burned his shirt, poured whiskey on the gravel of the clubhouse lot. Slade Cutter, who had ridden with Bishop for 11 years, had not spoken for 3 days afterward. Cole had stood at the edges of the memorial and felt something go out of him. Not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. Something more structural. The sense that the person who had first seen something worth vouching for in Cole Hargrove was gone, and with him the validation that Cole hadn't entirely destroyed his own life on a miscalculation. He had thrown himself deeper into the prospect work after that, harder, longer, with less sleep and less complaint. If Bishop was gone, then the only way to honor what Bishop had put in motion was to complete it, to earn what Bishop believed Cole could earn. He had not allowed himself to question anything about that logic. Until now. Cole stepped out of the sedan. The cold hit him immediately, the particular dry cold of the Nevada desert after midnight, the kind that doesn't penetrate gradually but arrives all at once like a judgment. He pulled his jacket collar up and moved along the sidewalk at an easy pace. No urgency, no hesitation. Just a man out for a late walk in a neighborhood where late walks were unusual enough to be worth noticing. He turned the corner onto Sycamore Court. 412 was a single-story ranch house with a covered porch and a hedge along the front that someone had trimmed recently. No lights inside. The driveway was empty. The oak tree in the front yard was old enough that its roots had begun to lift sections of the sidewalk, and Cole stepped carefully over the cracked concrete, keeping his feet quiet. He moved up the side of the driveway, staying inside the shadow of the oak. At the side of the house, there was a door that opened into what looked from the outside like a utility room. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a slim leather case containing a set of picks that Wade Pruitt had made him practice with until he could open a standard deadbolt in under 40 seconds. He had practiced for 3 months. He could do it in 22 now. The lock gave. The door swung inward on silent hinges. Cole stepped into darkness that smelled of laundry detergent and fabric softener. He stood still for 10 seconds, letting his eyes adjust, listening. The house was quiet. The refrigerator hummed from somewhere in the direction of the kitchen. Outside, a dog was barking 3 or 4 houses away, then stopped. He pulled the suppress point .22 from his waistband. His thumb found the safety and moved it off with a motion so practiced it required no conscious thought. He moved through the laundry room into the kitchen. Street light came through the blinds over the sink in long horizontal stripes, laying pale bars of light across the countertops and the hardwood floor. He crossed the kitchen. He stepped into the living room. "Don't step on the third board. It'll give you away." Cole stopped breathing. The voice came from the far corner of the room near a large bay window where the streetlight didn't reach. Calm, measured, carrying the particular authority of a man who has been sitting in the dark, waiting long enough to be completely comfortable there. A table lamp clicked on. The light was warm and low and fell across a faded leather recliner and the man sitting in it. He was lean and weathered with a gray beard trimmed close to his jaw and a glass of amber liquid held loosely in his right hand. He was wearing a plain flannel shirt, dark jeans, and boots that had seen considerable miles. He looked older than Cole remembered. The gray in his beard had spread, and there were new lines around his eyes, the kind that come from months of sustained stress rather than ordinary aging. But Cole would have recognized him anywhere. He would have recognized him in total darkness by voice alone, by the particular quality of his stillness. Earl Maddox, Bishop, the man they had burned a shirt for, the man they had poured whiskey into the gravel to mourn, the man who had been dead for 18 months. He was sitting in a leather recliner in a ranch house in Henderson, Nevada, holding a glass of whiskey and watching Cole Hargrove with the same steady appraising expression he had worn on a tailgate in Laughlin 3 years ago when he decided Cole Hargrove was worth talking to. Cole's arm dropped an inch without his permission. The gun was still in his hand, but it was no longer precisely aimed at anything. His chest felt like it had been struck by something. Not pain exactly, more like the internal concussion of a world that has just rearranged itself without warning. "I figured Damon would send you," Bishop said. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "You always were the most desperate for his approval." He paused. "That's not a criticism, kid. Just an observation." "Put the gun down." "You're dead," Cole said. His voice came out wrong. Not the flat, trained monotone he had cultivated for 2 years. Something rawer underneath it. Bishop looked at the gun, then back at Cole's face. "Am I? They said you were killed. In Kingman." The negotiation went wrong. "Damon says a lot of things," Bishop replied. He set his glass down on the side table next to the recliner and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Put the gun down, Cole. You're not a killer. Not yet, anyway. And I'd prefer we keep it that way." Cole stood very still in the striped light of the living room. The .22 in his hand was lighter than it had been an hour ago. Not physically, but in the way that a weapon becomes lighter when the target in front of you stops being a concept and becomes a person you recognize. Outside, the dog started barking again, then stopped. Cole lowered the barrel toward the floor. His hand was steadier than he expected. Bishop didn't move from the recliner. He watched Cole the way a man watches weather coming in from the west, with patience and without illusion about his ability to stop it. The lamp between them threw a circle of warm light that ended abruptly at the edges of the room, leaving the corners in deep shadow. Outside, the Henderson neighborhood was absolutely quiet. The kind of quiet that only exists in places where people feel safe, where the worst thing that happens on a Tuesday night is a sprinkler running too long. Cole stood with the .22 at his side and looked at the man he had mourned. "Sit down," Bishop said. "I'll stand." Bishop nodded as though this was the answer he had expected. He reached for his glass, took a measured sip, and set it back down. Then he said, "How long did it take you to drive here from the clubhouse?" Cole didn't answer. 40 minutes, give or take." Bishop supplied the answer himself, which means you've got maybe 2 hours before Damon starts wondering why you haven't called in. So I'm going to talk and you're going to listen, and then you're going to make a decision. That's the whole shape of tonight. You understand. Cole looked at him, at the new lines around his eyes, at the gray that had spread through the beard, at the hands that were resting loosely on his knees, unhurried, unafraid. Bishop had always had that quality, a kind of physical composure that didn't read as arrogance but as something deeper. The composure of a man who had already made his peace with the worst possible outcome of any given situation and was therefore free to think clearly about all the others. Talk, Cole said. Bishop reached to the side of the recliner and picked up a manila folder from the floor. It was thick, the kind of thickness that comes from months of accumulated paper rather than a single document. He held it out toward Cole. Cole didn't take it immediately. He looked at it the way you look at something you suspect will change things, with the instinct to delay the moment of contact. Then he took it. Open it. Cole moved to the couch across from Bishop and sat. He kept the 22 on his knee. He opened the folder. The first pages were bank statements, not domestic accounts. Offshore. The headers were in English, but the account structures were unmistakably Cayman Islands, the kind of layered corporate architecture that costs serious money to set up and exists for only one serious purpose. He thumbed through them slowly. The numbers were large. Not large in the way that a successful small business is large. Large in the way that sustained and deliberate extraction is large. The compounding of systematic theft over time. He turned to the next section. LLC registrations. Several of them filed in Nevada and Delaware, the two states where corporate anonymity is easiest to maintain. He read the registered agent names. Then he read the names of the listed principals. He stopped, read the name again, looked up at Bishop. Vivian Voss, Bishop said quietly. Damon's younger sister. Lives in Scottsdale. Works in real estate, allegedly. Has been the named principal in 4 separate LLCs over the past 3 years, each of which has received wire transfers from accounts connected to Iron Vale operating funds. Cole looked back at the papers. The transfer amounts were itemized, quarterly, consistent, the kind of consistency that requires planning and access in a complete absence of accountability. How much, Cole said. Over 3 years. Bishop paused. Just north of 4 million. The number sat in the air between them like something physical. Cole had known the club ran significant money. You couldn't spend 2 years inside the operation without developing a general sense of the financial scale. But $4 million extracted quietly over 3 years from a brotherhood that preached absolute loyalty as its founding principle was a different order of thing entirely. He turned to the next section of the folder, and then he stopped moving entirely. The photographs were surveillance quality, slightly grainy in the way that distance and telephoto lenses produce, but clear enough. The first showed Damon Voss sitting across a booth from a man in a collared shirt and khakis, the kind of clothing that reads as deliberately casual in a way that civilian clothes never quite are. They were in a diner, window booth, coffee cups on the table. Damon was leaning forward slightly talking. The man across from him was listening, and his posture had the particular attentiveness of someone whose job it is to listen carefully and remember everything. Cole had never seen that man before, but he had learned over 2 years to recognize a certain type. Federal, he said. Bishop nodded. There were 4 more photographs. Different locations, different dates, the same 2 men. One showed them in a parking garage. One showed them in what appeared to be a municipal park, standing near a fountain, both looking at something on Damon's phone. The last showed them parting ways outside a building that Cole didn't recognize, exchanging, nothing, maintaining the careful physical distance of people who understand they are potentially being watched. Cole closed the folder. He set it on the cushion beside him and looked at Bishop across the circle of lamplight. The 22 was still on his knee. He became aware of it the way you become aware of something you have been holding so long it stopped registering. Say it plainly, Cole said. Bishop leaned back in the recliner. His voice when he spoke was not angry. It wasn't dramatic. It had the quality of something that has been compressed under enormous pressure for a very long time and is now being released with careful control. Damon Voss has been meeting with a DEA task force coordinator for at least 18 months, Bishop said. The northbound runs that got hit last month weren't bad luck, and they weren't a rat in the lower ranks. The routes, the dates, the load manifests. Damon provided all of it, directly, to that man in those photographs. Cole said nothing. The two brothers who are looking at 20 to life, Bishop, rode those routes because Damon told them to. Specifically, he assigned them personally. Grady Lawson and Pete Morrow. You know them. Cole knew them. Grady Lawson had taught him how to change a tire on a loaded trailer in under 8 minutes. Pete Morrow had lent him a jacket the first winter when Cole's own hadn't been warm enough for overnight guard duty and hadn't said anything about it, just handed it over like it was nothing. I know them, Cole said. They're in a federal holding facility in Reno right now, Bishop said. Prosecutors are pushing for maximum sentencing. They have the load manifests, the communications, the routes, everything they need, because Damon gave it to them. Cole looked at the folder on the cushion beside him. He thought about Grady Lawson changing a tire in the dark. He thought about Pete Morrow handing over a jacket without ceremony. Why, he said. Bishop was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice carried something that was not quite bitterness and not quite sorrow, but occupied the territory between them. Because Grady was talking about running for chapter secretary, and Pete had been asking questions about the commissary fund accounting. Neither of them had found anything yet, but Damon couldn't be sure they wouldn't, so he removed them. Cleanly. No blood on Iron Veil hands. Just two brothers who happened to be on the wrong run at the wrong time, courtesy of a federal tip that Damon made look like an internal security failure. Cole sat with that for a moment. And you, he said. I was vice president for 11 years, Bishop said. I had access to the full financial records. I ran the annual audit. 3 years ago, I started noticing discrepancies. Small ones at first. The kind of thing you could explain as accounting error if you wanted to explain it that way. I didn't want to explain it that way. I pulled the thread. He paused. I found the LLCs. I found the transfer pattern. I took it to Damon privately because that was the right way to handle it. Man to man at the table before anyone else knew. I gave him the chance to answer for it. What did he say? Cole asked. He said I had misread the accounts and that I should let him know if I had any other concerns. Bishop's voice was dry and completely flat. 2 weeks later, he called me into his office and told me there was a situation in Kingman that needed my personal attention. Said a local outfit was making moves on our northern corridor, and that I was the only one he trusted to negotiate it properly. Cole understood where the story was going before Bishop finished it. The men waiting in Kingman weren't a local outfit, Bishop said. They were contract muscle, hired locally, paid in cash given my description and my vehicle information. I got there and something felt wrong before I even got out of the truck. I've been in enough bad situations to know what the air feels like right before one. I pulled out of the lot and drove instead of parking. 30 seconds later, 2 men came out of the building I had been told to enter. And they weren't local independent operators trying to negotiate territory. They had the body language of men waiting for a specific person to arrive. How did you get out? Cole asked. Drove straight through, Bishop said. Didn't stop until I was 2 states away. He looked down at his hands. I had my go bag in the truck. I always kept one. Old habit. I found a place, changed my appearance, started building this. He gestured toward the folder on the cushion beside Cole. 18 months, Cole said. 18 months. Bishop nodded. I couldn't go back. If I walked into that clubhouse, Damon would have me dead before I reached the church doors, and it would look like a justified response to a VP who had gone missing under questionable circumstances. I needed the documentation to be unassailable. I needed enough that when I put it in front of the national officers, there would be no room for Damon to maneuver. Cole looked at him, at the exhaustion that lived behind the composure. The 18 months were visible on him, the way hard time is always visible on men who have lived it, not in any single detail, but in the accumulation of everything. Then something shifted in Cole's thinking, a gear turning that he hadn't expected. You said you couldn't go back, Cole said slowly. So how did Damon know where you were? Bishop met his eyes. He found out I was still alive approximately 3 weeks ago. Bishop said it carefully. I made a contact I shouldn't have made. Someone I trusted who I shouldn't have trusted. Word got back, and Damon realized he had a problem that hadn't been solved the way he thought it had been. Cole understood the rest without being told. Damon had needed someone to send, someone who could handle a specific kind of work cleanly without the club's visible involvement, without the risk of sending a full-patch member who could be identified and connected back to the chapter. He had needed someone who existed in a kind of institutional purgatory, present enough to be trusted with the address, disposable enough to be abandoned if anything went wrong. A prospect. Cole felt something settle in him. Not surprise, something colder than surprise. The specific emotional temperature of a truth that has been approaching for a long time finally arriving. "You're the reason I'm here tonight," Cole said. "Not just in this house, in the club. You brought me in. You vouched for me. 2 years ago." "Yes," Bishop said. "So he sent me specifically." Bishop nodded slowly. "I think so." "Yes." Cole stood up. He walked to the window and looked out through the gap in the blinds at the quiet street outside. A porch light 2 houses down. A cat moving along the base of a fence. The ordinary nighttime life of a neighborhood that had no idea what was happening in the ranch house at 412 Sycamore Court. He thought about what Bishop had just laid out, not the moral dimensions of it. Not yet. The pure structural logic of the situation, the way he would think about a mechanical problem in the shop, tracing the load path, finding where the stress was concentrated. If he killed Bishop, he went back to the clubhouse with the confirmation Damon needed. He got his patch. He became a full brother. And Damon Voss owned him completely from that moment forward, because Damon would know exactly what Cole had done in a house in Henderson on a Tuesday night, and that knowledge would be a chain around Cole's neck for the rest of his life. Every decision Cole made inside the club would be shadowed by that knowledge. Every time he thought about speaking up about something, every time his conscience or his judgment told him to push back against anything Damon ordered, the chain would tighten. He would have paid for his patch with his soul, and Damon would hold the receipt. If he failed, if he walked away or was caught, the club would disavow him. He was a prospect, unpatched. He had no standing, no protection, no documented membership that a lawyer could leverage. He was, in the eyes of any investigation, a man who had gone to a house in Henderson with a suppressed weapon and bad intentions, with nothing connecting him to the chapter except a vest that had never been awarded a top rocker. Damon would express appropriate shock. Wade Pruitt would confirm that Cole had been exhibiting erratic behavior. The chapter would move on. Damon won either way. That was the architecture of it. Clean and elegant in the way that only genuinely cynical intelligence can construct a trap. Cole turned away from the window. "You planned for this," he said to Bishop. "You knew he would send someone eventually." "I knew he would send someone when he found out I was alive," Bishop said. "I chose this house because it's outside the chapter's normal operational territory, but close enough that the drive makes sense. I chose it because the neighborhood means nobody is going to start shooting first and ask questions later." "And you stayed," Cole said. "You could have run further, gone somewhere he would never find you." Bishop looked at him for a long moment. "I'm 61 years old," he said. "I spent 30 years building something. I believed in what it was supposed to be." He paused. "I'm not running from Damon Voss. I'm finishing this." Cole looked at the folder on the couch cushion, at the photographs of Damon in a diner booth with a federal agent, at the bank statements with Vivian Voss's name on the LLC registrations, at the transfer records showing $4 million quietly rerouted from the operating funds of a brotherhood whose members were going to prison on routes their president had sold. He thought about Grady Lawson in a federal holding facility in Reno. He thought about Pete Morrow asking questions about the commissary fund accounting. He thought about Wade Pruitt, who visited the locked-up brothers every month with what money the chapter could put together, not knowing that the fund those visits were supposed to draw from had been systematically drained by the man Wade had spent years protecting with his body and his loyalty and his absolute trust. He thought about Diane at the kitchen table in her green robe saying, "I can't love someone who doesn't belong to himself anymore." He had given 2 years of his life to a brotherhood that he now understood had been used as cover for one man's sustained theft. Every sacrifice he had made, every indignity he had absorbed, every hour of lost sleep and lost marriage had been in service of a fiction. The Brotherhood was real in the sense that the men around it were real Slade Cutter and Wade Pruitt and the others men who believed in something. But what sat at the center of it, what had been directing it and benefiting from it, was not what any of them thought it was. Cole picked up the folder from the couch cushion. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a long moment, at the weight of it, at what it represented. 18 months of a man's life reduced to paper and photographs and routing numbers. The cost of telling the truth inside an organization that considered truth a form of betrayal. "We need to go back," he said. Bishop didn't look surprised, but something in his face shifted. Something that might have been relief, though, on Bishop's face, relief was almost indistinguishable from resolve. "Tonight," Cole said. Bishop nodded once. "I go in first." Cole was already thinking through the sequence of it, the way you plan a mechanical job, step by step, accounting for what can go wrong at each stage. "I go in alone. I report to Damon that the job is done. I get inside the church while they are still processing it. You come in behind me 2 minutes after I'm through the door. Not enough time for them to lock down, but enough time for me to get positioned." Bishop stood from the recliner. He moved to the desk against the far wall, opened the bottom drawer, and produced a heavy .45 Colt 1911 that he checked with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom firearm handling is as automatic as breathing. He loaded the magazine, seated it chambered around, and tucked it into the back of his waistband. "Wade Pruitt is going to try to shoot me the moment he sees me," Bishop said. Cole considered this. Wade Pruitt was not a complicated man. He was loyal and he was effective, and he operated on a binary that divided the world into things that threatened the chapter and things that didn't. A man who had been declared dead appearing alive in the church would register in Wade's processing as an extreme threat that required an immediate physical response. "Wade won't shoot if he doesn't understand what's happening," Cole said. "And he won't understand what's happening for at least 30 seconds. That's the window. 30 seconds isn't much of a window. It's enough if we use it right." Bishop looked at him for a moment with the particular attention he had always given Cole, the attention that had felt 3 years ago on a tailgate in Laughlin, like being seen by someone who actually knew what they were looking at. "You know what you're walking into," Bishop said. It was not a question. Cole tucked the .22 back into his waistband and pulled his jacket over it. He picked up the burner phone from the coffee table and looked at the address still glowing on the screen. 412 Sycamore Court. Then he put it in his pocket. "I know exactly what I'm walking into," he said. They went out through the side door, back through the utility room that smelled of detergent and fabric softener, and into the cold Nevada night. The oak tree cast its shadow across the driveway. Somewhere 2 streets over, a sprinkler system clicked on and began its soft percussion against the grass. Cole walked to the sedan. Bishop fell into step beside him, slightly behind the way men walk when they have reached an understanding about who is leading. At the car, Cole stopped and looked across the roof at the older man. 18 months, Cole said, living like a ghost, building the file, waiting. Bishop met his eyes over the roof of the sedan. "What of it? Was it worth it?" Cole asked. Bishop was quiet for a moment. The sprinkler clicked and hissed 2 streets over. The frost on the guardrails had spread, and the streetlights caught it and turned it silver. "Ask me again in a couple hours," Bishop said. They got in the car. Cole started the engine. The bleach and stale cigarette smell was still there. He had stopped noticing it sometime in the past hour. He pulled away from the curb and navigated back out through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, past the minivans and the basketball hoops and the porch light 2 houses down, and turned onto the main road heading west. The desert opened up ahead of them, vast and black and patient. Cole set the cruise control at 5 miles under the speed limit. He used his turn signals. Beside him, Bishop sat with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the road ahead and said nothing. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two men who have said what needed to be said and are now on the other side of it in the territory where words don't help, and action is the only remaining language. The glow of the city began to bleed into the sky on the western horizon, the eternal light pollution halo rising orange and white against the darkness. Cole watched it grow as they drove and thought about Damon Voss, sitting at the head of the church table with his pale eyes and his quiet voice and his absolute certainty that the world would arrange itself according to his design. He thought about the patch on the table, the leather, the embroidered skull with its wings spread, the thing he had spent 2 years making himself into a different person to deserve. He thought about Diane's taillights pulling out of the apartment lot on that last Tuesday. He thought about Grady Lawson teaching him to change a tire in the dark. He thought about the burner phone sitting silent in his pocket. Damon was waiting for confirmation. The window was measured in minutes now, not hours. Every mile the sedan covered was a mile closer to a confrontation that had no guaranteed outcome, in several ways to end badly. Cole understood this with complete clarity and drove toward it anyway. That was perhaps the first genuinely free decision he had made in 2 years, in 1 month, in 11 days. Not free of consequence, not free of risk, but free in the sense that it belonged entirely to him, made without the weight of institutional expectation pressing down on every angle of his judgment. He pressed the accelerator slightly and watched the speedometer settle, and he drove west toward the light on the horizon with the steady, deliberate calm of a man who has finally, after a very long time, decided exactly what he is and exactly what he is not. The Iron Veil compound materialized out of the desert dark the way it always did suddenly, and without gradation, the security lights blazing against the black sky, like something that had decided it had the right to exist out here, regardless of what the desert thought about it. The perimeter fence ran 12 feet high with razor wire along the top. The gate was reinforced steel. The clubhouse itself was a long, low building of concrete block and corrugated metal that had been added to over the years in a way that prioritized function over any consideration of appearance. The porch light was on above the front entrance. Damon had said it would be. Leave the porch light on for you. Cole had thought when Damon said it that it was the kind of thing a man says when he wants you to feel welcomed into something. He understood now that it was the kind of thing a man says when he wants you to find your way back to him in the dark. The distinction was significant. Cole parked the sedan in the gravel lot and killed the engine. He sat for a moment in the silence. Beside him, Bishop had not spoken for the last 20 minutes of the drive. He sat with his hands loose in his lap and his eyes on the compound entrance, reading it the way only someone who had spent years inside it could read it. 2 prospects on the door, Bishop said quietly. Recognize them. Cole looked. 2 young men under the awning to the left of the entrance, both in prospect vests, both trying to look like standing in the cold at 2 in the morning was something they did by choice. Denny Marsh and the new one. Kowalski, Cole said. They have been in maybe 4 months. They won't know what you went out to do tonight. Nobody tells prospects anything, Cole said. That's the point. Bishop nodded. He reached back and adjusted the .45 at his waistband, then pulled his jacket over it. He looked at Cole. 2 minutes, Cole said. Count them properly. I know how to count 2 minutes. Cole opened the door and stepped out into the cold. The gravel crunched under his boots with a sound that seemed too loud for the night. He walked toward the entrance at a pace that communicated nothing unusual. Controlled. Even. The walk of a man returning from an errand, not the walk of a man who had just spent an hour in a Henderson living room having the architecture of his entire existence dismantled and rebuilt on different foundations. Denny Marsh looked up as Cole approached. He gave the slight nod that prospects gave to someone senior in the hierarchy, deferential without being servile. Cole returned it and pushed through the front door without breaking stride. The main bar was quieter than it had been when he left, but not empty. Rhett Galloway was at the bar with a bottle in front of him, not drinking from it, just keeping it company. 2 other members Cole didn't immediately place were playing pool at the far table, moving slowly without enthusiasm, the way men move when they are waiting for something, and using the physical activity to manage the waiting. The jukebox was still dark and silent. Everyone looked up when Cole entered. Nobody said anything. He walked straight through the main room, past the pool tables, past Rhett Galloway, and his untouched bottle to the hallway at the back. His boots on the wooden floor sounded deliberate and unhurried. He reached the oak doors of the church. He did not knock. He turned the handle and pushed them open and walked in. The room was exactly as he had left it. Cigar smoke stratified in blue layers under the fluorescent lights. The 11 men around the long table. Damon at the head, the leather chair, the pale eyes that came up from whatever he had been looking at the moment the door opened. Wade Pruitt, standing in the corner arms, crossed his scarred face, registering Cole's arrival with the careful attention of a man whose job it is to register arrivals. Slade Cutter was halfway down the table on the right side. He was a big man going gray with a face that had been rearranged once or twice over the years and had settled into something that was more interesting than conventionally hard. He had been Bishop's closest friend in the chapter. Cole had watched him at the memorial pouring whiskey onto the gravel with a steadiness that was clearly costing him something. Cole walked to the center of the room and stopped. He did not look at Damon's hands. He looked at the clock on the wall above the door, the institutional round-faced clock that had hung there for as long as he had been coming to this building. 3:41 in the morning. He had been gone 2 hours and 22 minutes. He knew with the calm certainty of a man who has done the arithmetic and doesn't like the answer that Damon had been watching that same clock. The window had been closing. Another 10 minutes and Damon would have made a different call entirely. Cole reached into his waistband with 2 fingers and produced the suppressed .22. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the warmth of it, from being carried against his body for the past 2 hours. Then he set it on the center of the oak table. It came to rest, pointing slightly left of center, the suppressor angling toward the middle of the table. He straightened up. "It's done," he said. The room took a breath. Damon Voss looked at the gun on the table. Then he looked at Cole's face, reading it with the particular intensity he deployed when he was calibrating whether something matched his expectations. Whatever he found there must have satisfied him, because the tension around his eyes released slightly and the smile came. Slow and controlled, the smile of a man who has been right about something important and is permitting himself the private satisfaction of it. He reached into the wooden cigar box beside his chair and produced a folded square of black leather. He set it on the table in front of him, smoothed it once with his palm, and left his hand resting on it. "I told him," Damon said, looking around the table at the assembled men. "I told him this kid had the stomach for it. 2 years of eating our dirt, and he comes through when it matters. That's loyalty, brothers. That's what the patch means." He stood. He picked up the leather patch and walked around the end of the table toward Cole. The room watched. Cole could feel the collective attention like a physical pressure. "Welcome to the family," Damon said. He held the patch out. "He doesn't want it." The voice came from the doorway behind Cole, and it hit the room the way a rifle shot hits an open space, sharp and total, and immediately restructuring everything around it. Every head turned. Damon Voss stopped moving. His arm was still extended with the patch in his hand, and he stopped in exactly that position, like a man whose film has been paused by someone else's remote. Earl Maddox stood in the doorway of the church. He was soaking wet from the cold outside. His flannel shirt darkened at the shoulders, where the air had condensed against the fabric during the walk from the parking lot. His gray beard was damp. He stood with his hands at his sides, not reaching for the .45 at his back, not gesturing, not performing anything. He simply stood there and let the fact of his existence do the work. The silence that followed was not like ordinary silence. It was the silence of a room in which a dozen men have simultaneously encountered something that their understanding of the world had categorically excluded, and their minds are running the verification process as fast as they can, checking and rechecking what their eyes are reporting against what they know to be true, and finding that the reconciliation is taking longer than it should. Slade Cutter made a sound. It was not a word. It was the involuntary sound a man makes when something reaches through his chest and takes hold of something fundamental. Wade Pruitt's hand moved to his hip, his fingers wrapped around the grip of the revolver holstered there. He did not draw it. He stood with his hand on it and his eyes fixed on the man in the doorway with an expression that was trying to be threat assessment, and kept sliding into something that looked like a man staring at something he has dreamed about and cannot trust. Bishop Wade said, "Not a challenge, not a question, just the word itself spoken the way a man speaks a name he has said 10,000 times and never expected to say again." His voice was stripped of everything but the name, and underneath it, the helpless, unguarded shock of genuine recognition. "You buried an empty box," Bishop said. He walked into the room. He moved the same way he always moved, without hurry, without the performance of authority, with the authority itself. He stopped at the table's edge and looked around it, making eye contact with each man in turn. Not Damon, not yet. The others first. Slade, Wade, the men on the left side of the table. A man named Curtis, who had ridden with Bishop on 3 different runs, and who was now staring at him with an expression of complete and helpless shock. He reached into his jacket. Every man in the room stiffened. Wade Pruitt's grip tightened on his revolver. Bishop produced the manila folder. He set it on the center of the table directly beside the suppressed point. 2-2. Bylaw Section 4, Paragraph 2, Bishop said. Any fully patched member has the right to address the table to present evidence of conduct unbecoming the Brotherhood. I am a fully patched member. I am addressing the table. He's not a member anymore, Damon said. His voice had recovered its composure. The shock that had crossed his face when Bishop walked through the door had lasted perhaps 2 seconds before the executive function reasserted itself, and now he was operating from behind the controlled mask that Cole had spent 2 years misreading as certainty and now understood was something different, something that required constant maintenance. "He's a ghost," Damon continued. "He has been running for 18 months. We don't know where he has been or who he has been talking to. For all we know, he walked in here wearing a wire." "Open the folder," Slade Bishop said. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke to Slade Cutter the way you speak to someone you have known for 11 years and trust with the thing you need trusted. Slade looked at Damon, then he looked at Bishop. Something moved across his face, an old loyalty warring with a new uncertainty, and the uncertainty won because it was grounded in something Slade had always valued more than comfort, which was the truth of things. He reached out and opened the folder. The pages were what they were. Bank statements don't have expressions. Numbers don't perform innocence or guilt. They simply exist, and the pattern they form either adds up to something or it doesn't. Slade turned the pages slowly. His face was very still in the way that faces go still when the emotion running through them is too large to show on the surface. He got to the LLC registrations. He read the name of the registered principal on the first one, then the second, then the third. He set those pages down and picked up the next section. The photographs. He looked at the first one for a long time. He tilted it slightly toward the fluorescent light overhead. He turned it over as though checking the back of it would tell him something, then turned it face up again. "What is this?" Slade said. His voice was very quiet. "That's a DEA task force coordinator," Bishop said. "His name is in the documentation behind the photos. He and Damon have met 6 times in the past 18 months. The routing numbers for the information transfers are in the bank records. Cross-reference the dates of the federal intercepts on our northbound runs with the dates of those meetings." Slade set the photograph down. He did not look at Damon. "Read me the names," Bishop said. "The ones in the last section. The Federal Holding Manifest." Slade turned to the last section of the folder. He found the page. He read, and his voice when he read was the voice of a man reciting something sacred or unbearable, or both. "Grady Lawson," Slade said. "Pete Morrow." The names landed in the room with the weight of everything they represented. 2 men in federal custody. 2 men who had ridden these routes because a man at the head of this table had told them to, knowing exactly what waited for them when they arrived. Wade Pruitt's hand came off his revolver. It was a small movement. His fingers simply uncurled from the grip, and his arm dropped to his side, and he stood differently, the way a man stands differently, when the physical certainty that was organizing his body into a posture of readiness quietly dissolves. What replaced it was not weakness. It was something older and harder and more permanent than the readiness had been. He had visited Grady Lawson and Pete Morrow every month. Cole knew this because Wade had mentioned it exactly once in passing, without sentiment the way he mentioned everything practical. He had driven to the federal facility in Reno with whatever money the commissary fund could put together, and he had sat across a table from two men who trusted him, and he had brought them what the Brotherhood was supposed to bring men in that situation. He had done this faithfully, month after month, not knowing that the fund he was drawing from had been hollowed out by the man whose chair sat at the head of this table. He looked at the bank statements now with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he wishes he hadn't started. Those accounts, Wade said. He was not directing the statement at anyone in particular. He was saying it to himself in the way that men sometimes need to hear their own voice confirm what their eyes are reading. Those are Iron Veil operating funds. 3 years of it, Bishop said. Wade looked up from the table. He looked at Damon Voss with an expression that Cole had never seen on Wade Pruitt's face before, and suspected very few people had ever seen there. It was not rage. Rage was too simple and too hot for what was on Wade Pruitt's face. It was the expression of a man who has just understood that something he organized his entire moral life around was built on a rotting foundation, and the understanding is physical as much as intellectual. It moves through the body differently than anger does. It settles into the bones. Is it true, Wade said. His voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It had the quality of a sound made in a very small room by someone who has run out of room to retreat into. Damon looked at him. For a moment, Cole thought Damon was going to try one more architecture, one more construction of plausible explanation institutional defense, the kind of verbal structure that had apparently served him for 3 years while he drained the funds and sold the routes and had Bishop's murder contracted out to men in a parking lot in Kingman. Damon was intelligent enough to attempt it. He had the vocabulary and the composure and the years of practiced authority. But he looked at Wade Pruitt's face and understood that the vocabulary wouldn't work on that face tonight. Some faces in some moments are beyond the reach of words. Wade Pruitt's face in that moment was one of them. I built this chapter, Damon said. The statement came out measured and almost calm. I made us feared from the California border to Utah. I took the risks. I made the calls. I kept this table from falling apart 3 different times when lesser men would have let it collapse. He paused, and in the pause, Cole could see him making a final internal calculation, the assessment of a man who has run out of better options and has decided to own what he cannot explain away. I took my compensation accordingly. The admission landed in the room without drama. No explosion, no surge of immediate violence. Just the word compensation settling into the accumulated silence of everything that had been understood in the last 10 minutes, and the men around the table absorbing it each in their own way. Men process betrayal at different speeds. Some faces showed it immediately. Others went carefully blank, which is its own kind of showing. Slade Cutter closed the folder. He did it carefully, aligning the edges, pressing the cover flat with the palm of his hand. He set it back on the table surface and left his hand resting on it and looked at the wood grain of the table for a moment, and then he looked at his hand, and then he looked at nothing in particular. 11 years of riding with a man Cole thought watching him. 11 years of what you thought was mutual belief in the same thing. And now this. You compensated from the commissary fund, Wade said. The words came out with a flatness that was more devastating than any volume could have been. You took from the fund for the men in cages. You took from Grady and Pete. Damon started to answer. He didn't finish the answer. His right hand moved instead, dropping behind his hip, reaching for the snub-nosed revolver he carried at his back. The movement was quick and committed the movement of a man who has made a final calculation and found that his only remaining option is the option he has always kept in reserve. He was not aiming for Wade. He was not aiming for Slade or anyone at the table. He was aiming for Bishop. Bishop was the architecture of the case against him. Bishop was the 18 months of documentation and the photographs and the routing numbers and the LLC registrations. With Bishop gone, the folder was paper without a witness. A dead man's accusations in a room full of men who had just heard their president admit to compensation and might with time and pressure be managed into a different interpretation of what that word had meant. The calculation took less than a second and was completely rational given Damon's understanding of his situation, which was the understanding of a man who had controlled everything for so long that he had perhaps forgotten what it felt like when control ends. Cole did not think. Thinking was not the right word for what happened in the space between Damon's hand moving and Cole's hand moving. It was something below thinking, something installed by 2 years of brutal training and 18 months of loss. And the better part of one night in a Henderson living room, looking at photographs of a man he had trusted sitting in a diner booth with a federal agent. It was the body operating on a truth that the mind had only just finished articulating. He moved his right hand to the table. He picked up the suppressed .22. He raised it and he fired twice. The sound was not silence. Suppressed firearms are not silent regardless of what films suggest. But the sound was compact and contained two sharp mechanical reports that the room absorbed quickly, leaving behind a ringing that faded within seconds into the hum of the air conditioning, in the fluorescent lights, in the complete stillness of 11 men who have just watched something irreversible happen. Damon Voss had gotten his revolver halfway out of its holster. The momentum of the draw carried his arm forward slightly, even as his body registered what had happened. And then his legs stopped working in the reliable way that legs stop working when the chest sustains that kind of damage. And he went backward against the arm of his leather chair, and then sideways, one hand catching the edge of the oak table and leaving a dark smear across the grain as he slid to the floor. The revolver hit the hardwood and skidded 6 inches and stopped. Nobody moved to pick it up. Cole stood with the .22 still raised the suppressor, tracing a slow arc back toward center, then dropping as his arm lowered. The smell of propellant reached him a moment after the sound had faded. He looked at Damon on the floor beside the chair at the precise and irreversible mechanics of what had happened, and he felt the reality of it pass through him in a wave that was neither regret nor satisfaction, but something that contained elements of both and resolved into neither. He became aware of the room again. 11 men around a table, none of them moving, none of them reaching for weapons or for phones. Wade Pruitt was standing exactly where he had been standing, his arms at his sides, looking at the floor where Damon had fallen, with an expression that Cole could not fully read and did not try to. It was not his expression to interpret. What Wade Pruitt was processing in that moment belonged entirely to Wade Pruitt, in the 11 years he had spent as the instrument of a man he had just watched die. Slade Cutter was looking at Bishop. Bishop was looking at Cole. The silence stretched for what felt much longer than it probably was. In Cole's experience, significant silences always expanded to fill the space that the event before them had created. It was Bishop who moved first. He walked to the table. He looked down at the leather patch that had fallen when Damon went backward, knocked from the edge of the table where Damon had set it down. It lay on the floor near the chair, the embroidered death's head facing upward, the white wings spread against the black leather. Bishop looked at it for a moment without expression. Then he bent and picked it up. He held it for a moment in both hands, and Cole watched something move across his face, something old and complicated that Bishop had apparently been carrying for a long time and was only now in this room allowing to show. Then Bishop turned and held the patch out toward Cole. "You saved my life tonight," Bishop said. His voice was quiet and level and completely without performance. "You walked back into this room knowing what you were walking into, and you did the right thing when the moment came. There isn't a man in this room who won't stand behind you now. Take it. You have earned it." Cole looked at the patch in Bishop's outstretched hand. The embroidered skull, the white wings spread against black leather. He had spent 2 years building toward this object, had told himself on every bad night that it was the destination, the proof that the sacrifice had meant something. Around the table, 11 men waited in the kind of silence that forms when everyone in the room understands that a threshold is being crossed and no one wants to be the one to rush it. Slade Cutter still had his palm flat on the closed folder. Wade Pruitt had straightened up and gone very still, his face in a configuration that might not ever fully return to what it had been before tonight. The others watched with the careful neutrality of men who understand they are witnessing something that will define what comes next. Cole's eyes went to the floor. To his prospect vest lying there, the leather darkening where it had landed in the spreading stain beside Damon's chair. 2 years of his life stitched into the grain of that leather. Every cold night standing guard over motorcycles in the rain. Every 14-hour run across state lines. Every morning he had driven away from an apartment he no longer lived in. Every moment of the particular degradation that comes from surrendering your own judgment to men whose judgment it turned out was not worth the surrender. He set the point 2-2 down on the table. He put it down gently without drama in the same place he had put it when he first walked in tonight. Then he reached up and unclipped the front of his prospect vest. He shrugged it off his shoulders. He held it for a moment, the leather worn soft by 2 years of daily use, shaped now to the specific contours of his body, warm from being worn. He let it drop. It fell straight down and landed in the expanding dark stain on the hardwood floor, and the leather darkened immediately where it made contact, and that was that. "Keep it," Cole said. He said it quietly, not to Bishop specifically, not to the room, to himself perhaps. To the 2 years, to the Tuesday morning with the suitcases in the hallway, to every version of himself that had stood in the cold and the dark and told himself it was going to mean something when it was over, that the cost would be justified by what was waiting on the other side. He turned away from the table. He walked to the oak doors of the church and he pushed them open and he walked through without looking back. The main bar was still occupied. Rhett Galloway was still at the bar with his bottle. The two men at the pool table had stopped moving entirely. Everyone was looking at the hallway Cole had come out of, listening to the silence from the church, understanding that the quality of that silence was different from what it had been before, that whatever had happened in that room had permanently rearranged something. Cole walked through the main room at the same measured pace he always walked, past the pool tables, past Rhett Galloway, who said nothing and did not move, past the empty jukebox, across the floor and through the front door, and out into the Nevada night. The cold hit him immediately, harder than before. He was not wearing a vest now, and the temperature had dropped another 3 or 4 degrees while he had been inside, and the wind off the desert had picked up and was moving against him as he walked across the gravel lot. He felt it directly against his shirt, against his arms, against the back of his neck. He stopped in the middle of the lot. He stood there for a long moment with the cold working against the fabric of his shirt and the gravel under his boots and the security lights of the compound throwing a shadow out long and thin behind him toward the perimeter fence. The porch light above the entrance was still on. He looked at it, the single yellow bulb in its wire cage, burning faithfully for a man to find his way back by. He had found his way back. It just hadn't led where anyone expected. He looked at the porch light for a moment longer. Then he looked away. The sedan was where he had left it. He walked to it and opened the driver's side door and sat down inside. He did not start the engine immediately. He sat in the silence of the car and the smell of bleach and stale cigarettes that had long since stopped registering, and he looked through the windshield at the compound entrance. Denny Marsh and Kowalski were still under the awning. They were standing differently now, both of them very still, with the posture of young men who have sensed that something significant has happened inside the building they are guarding and are waiting to find out what it means for them. Their faces carried the particular alertness of people who have heard something they can't categorize and are in the process of deciding whether it requires them to act. They would find out. In an hour or a day, depending on how the men inside managed the next several hours, the prospects would find out what had happened in the church tonight. They would have to decide what it meant for their own trajectory, whether the thing they had signed up for was still the thing they had signed up for now that its center had been exposed and removed, whether the brotherhood they believed they were building toward was worth continuing to build toward, or whether the corruption that had been running through its core had compromised the whole structure beyond repair. Cole did not envy them that decision. He had just completed his own version of it, and it had taken him somewhere he was still in the early stages of understanding. He thought about Bishop, about the 18 months in a house in Henderson, building a case from the ruins of a life that had been taken from him by the man he had served for 11 years. About the particular exhaustion that lived behind the older man's composure, the exhaustion of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and has organized his entire existence around the holding of it. Cole hoped he would put it down now. He suspected the putting down would take longer than the carrying had. That was generally how it went with men like Bishop. The weight in the man had become too thoroughly acquainted to separate cleanly. He thought about Grady Lawson and Pete Morrow in a federal facility in Reno, and about what the folder on the table in the church might mean for their situation if it was handled correctly. The documentation was unassailable, Bishop had said. Routing numbers transfer records, photographs of meetings. The kind of evidence that, in the right hands and through the right channels, could potentially reframe the narrative of how two men came to be on a run that was already compromised before they started their engines. He did not know if it would be handled correctly. That was not his problem to solve tonight. He had solved his problem. He thought about what Bishop had said about finishing things. "I'm not running from Damon Voss. I'm finishing this." He had meant it as a statement of principle of refusal to be driven out of something he had built. Cole understood it differently now, sitting in the sedan with the compound behind him. Finishing something didn't always mean standing your ground at the center of it until the end. Sometimes finishing something meant knowing when your part of it was done and walking away from the rest cleanly without hesitation, without looking back at the door as it closed. Cole had walked away cleanly. He was still working out whether that was the right thing. He suspected he would be working it out for a long time. The rightness of a decision and the completeness of a decision are not always the same category, and tonight had produced both, which was more than he had come in expecting. He reached into his jacket pocket and found his actual phone. Not the burner, which was still in his other pocket and which he would need to think about disposing of before the night was much further along. His own phone with his own contacts and his own accumulated history of calls and messages and the digital record of a life that had existed before the Iron Veil and that would continue to exist after it. He looked at the screen. It was 3:47 in the morning. He sat with the phone in his hand for a while and thought about what he would say if she answered. He had not called Diane in 4 months. He did not know with any certainty that she would want to hear from him, particularly not at 3:47 on a Wednesday morning, particularly not after 14 months of silence that was only occasionally broken by the terse formal exchanges required to manage the logistics of a life coming apart. He had no speech prepared. He had not earned the right to a speech, and even if he had, the things he needed to say were not the kind that improved with preparation. They were the kind that needed to come out in whatever form they took when they finally came out, because their value was in the rawness of them and not in the construction. He would tell her he was done. He would tell her she had been right. He would tell her that he had gone somewhere very dark trying to find something he couldn't name and had come out the other side of it still breathing, which was more than he had deserved and possibly more than he had expected, and that he didn't know what that meant for anything between them, but that he needed her to know he was standing on his own ground again, that he belonged to himself again in a way he hadn't been able to say honestly in over 2 years. He would tell her that. Whatever she did with it was hers to decide. He looked at the compound entrance one more time, at the porch light still burning, at the two young men under the awning who were about to have a very difficult few days as the chapter worked through what had happened tonight, at the razor wire along the top of the perimeter fence catching the security lights and turning them silver. Then he put the car in reverse and backed out of the space. He drove to the gate. It swung open on its automatic mechanism as the sensor registered the sedan's transponder. He rolled through at idle speed, the gravel giving way to the cracked asphalt of the access road. The access road giving way to the two-lane highway that ran back toward the city. He did not look in the rearview mirror. The desert opened up on either side of the highway, and the dark came down around the car, and the headlights pushed a narrow corridor of visibility through it, the way headlights always do, illuminating only what is immediately ahead and leaving everything else to the imagination and to whatever patience the dark requires. Cole drove. The speedometer settled at exactly the speed limit. His hands rested on the wheel. The heater fan ticked beneath the dash, and the warmth it pushed across his boots was the same warmth it had been pushing all night, and the smell of rust from somewhere in the ductwork was the same smell. Everything else was different. He thought about what Diane had said. that she couldn't love someone who didn't belong to himself anymore. He had spent 14 months interpreting that as a verdict, a judgment delivered, and then withdrawn, leaving him to serve out whatever sentence the absence of her constituted. He had been wrong about that. He understood it differently now out here in the dark, with the desert running on in both directions and the city lights growing on the horizon. It had not been a verdict. It had been a door she had left open, a description of a condition that implied its opposite. If the condition was that he didn't belong to himself, then the door led back to the place where he did. She had not said she couldn't love him. She had said she couldn't love the version of him that had stopped being a version of him. The distinction was everything. It was possibly the only distinction that mattered. He picked up his phone. He found her name in the contacts and looked at it for a moment, at the simple, familiar letters of it, at everything underneath the surface of those letters that couldn't be seen until you had been far enough away to look back at it clearly. He pressed call. The phone rang once. Twice, he kept his eyes on the road and did not count the rings after that. The desert was doing what the desert always does at 4 in the morning, existing without apology, without comfort, without the pretense that it owed anyone anything. He thought about the two prospects standing under the awning back at the compound. Denny Marsh and Kowalski, 4 months in, still in the early phase where the believing feels like enough to carry you. He had believed in something too once, and the believing had cost him his shop and his marriage, and 2 years of his life, and one night that he would carry differently than anything else he had ever carried. And he was driving away from all of it at exactly the speed limit, with his hands steady on the wheel. The difference was that he was driving away. That was not nothing. He was beginning to understand that it was actually something substantial. He was 3 miles from the compound when the line clicked and he heard her voice. It was sleep-roughened and cautious, the voice of someone coming awake at an hour that signals emergency or both. And underneath the caution was something else that Cole registered without immediately being able to name. The faint, careful presence of someone who has not entirely closed the door. Cole, she said. Just his name. The way she had always said his name when she was deciding something about him, holding it in her mouth for a moment before committing to whatever came after. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. On the corridor of light the headlights made through the dark. I'm done, he said. I wanted you to know that first, before anything else. Whatever else there is to say, that part comes first. The line was quiet for a moment, not a dead quiet, a thinking quiet, the kind that has texture to it. Outside, the desert ran on vast and dark and unchanged by everything that had happened in it tonight. It did not care about what men decided in ranch houses in Henderson or what they said to each other over phones at 4 in the morning. It had been here before all of them, and it would be here after, and it held no opinion about any of it. Then Diane said, okay, just that. A single word, small and deliberate and containing more than it appeared to on the surface. It was not forgiveness. It was not a welcome. It was something more careful than either of those things, a word that held the door from closing completely without committing to opening it further. A word that said, I hear you and I am not hanging up, and that is what I can offer at 4 in the morning from where I am standing, which is somewhere between the life we had and whatever comes next. And whether there is a whatever comes next is a question that neither of us can answer tonight. Cole understood all of this without her having to say any of it. Okay, he said back. He drove west through the dark toward the city lights bleeding into the horizon, and the desert opened up around him, and the frost on the guardrails caught the glow from the headlights and turned the edges of the road silver. He had been a prospect for the Iron Veil MC for 2 years, 1 month, and 11 days. He had given them everything they asked for and a great deal more besides. He had stood in the rain and taken the beatings and driven the unmarked cars and mopped the floors and surrendered the pieces of himself that institutions demand as the price of belonging until there was so little of himself left that the woman who loved him could not find him in the remaining pieces. He had walked back into himself tonight in a ranch house in Henderson in the moment he lowered a gun he had not fired. He had finished the walk in a church room at the center of a compound in the desert in the moment he set a vest down on a blood-stained floor and said two words that were the truest thing he had said in over 2 years. Keep it. He drove toward the lights. He held the phone. The line was still open, neither of them speaking, just the sound of his tires on the asphalt and her breathing on the other end of the connection, and the night between them, which was a large thing, but not perhaps as permanent as it had seemed 14 months ago, when she picked up her suitcases and walked through a door he hadn't thought to hold open. He had learned something about doors tonight. He drove toward the light belonging to himself, and he did not look back at the dark behind him. And he waited to find out what came next. And for the first time in a very long time, the waiting felt like possibility instead of punishment.